Welcome, everyone. Sorry for the little delay and for the change in program. Steve Clemons is on his way back from Dulles Airport. He's just arrived from Italy and will be joining us, I think, midway through the program. But we're very excited to have Ad Melkert here today. He's the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Iraq. And extraordinary timing given the events this week around the veto of the electoral process in Iraq, the more recent spike in violence, and the split screen effect, really, that we're having with Afghanistan and the decision making about strategy on the one hand, and the at least from the outside, the potential for Iraq to be, which direction is Iraq going in? Is it continuing to make progress and stabilizing? Is it starting to go backwards with the increase in violence? Where is Iraq going? What is the international community to do going forward as we move into this period of the elections and then the American drawdown? Really, this is extraordinarily timely and important to make sure that we're keeping our eye on all pieces of the international puzzle and not overly focused, as this town can be on one problem at a time, but making sure that we really have a broad overview and are making sure that we don't drop any balls. So I just want to do a quick introduction of the Special Representative and then bring him up here to speak. And then what we'll do is he'll speak for as long as he wants, really. 15, 20 minutes perhaps would be good. And then I'll ask a few questions and we'll open it up to the floor for Q&A. At some point during that, I think Steve's going to be joining us, but we'll get the show on the road. So today we're just really pleased to have Special Representative Melkert with us. He is currently the Special Representative for Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in Iraq, and was preceded in that office, not directly, by Sergio Vieiro de Mello, the great emergency coordinator whose life was cut tragically short back in, I want to say this was 2003. Before his position, before he joined as Special Representative, Mr. Melkert was the Assistant Administrator to the UN Development Program, and before that, Executive Director at the World Bank, where he had some interesting dealings with the then President. Melkert also served as a parliamentarian in the Netherlands and led the Dutch Labour Party until 2002. So with that quick and incomplete bio, I just want to welcome Ad Melkert to the stage, and we're looking forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for that kind introduction and for the opportunity also to speak here this afternoon. Because certainly there are more problems in the world than just one. And Iraq is still very much a challenge, though at the same time an opportunity for the world to make progress, for the UN to play its part, and to do that in very close cooperation with the United States, of course, given the position of the US. But also with a perspective of the changes, of the drawdown, of the changing relationship between Iraq and the US. And it should necessarily bring many more players in the world into Iraq as partner and in trying to support processes that, in my view, are crucial for the global balance and stability, and that will make Iraq and keep Iraq very, very relevant for the foreseeable future. So it's very important to be able to talk about that. Let me just say a few words about where we are right now with the election preparation, and then try to focus on the challenges ahead, the agenda for after the elections, and the way that we from the UN side are preparing ourselves for that period, are talking to our counterparts in Iraq, and obviously are also seeking coordination with the US. On the elections, we thought on the 8th of November, after a long process of discussion in the Iraqi parliament that the deal was there on the law. It was actually a very interesting process in a country where Parliament is completing now its first full term. The first elected Parliament is completing its term. And it was actually a very good discussion representing the different sides, different interests, different views, but nothing different basically from parliamentary processes elsewhere, apart that it took a bit longer than we had advised, as we thought that mid-October was the time for a decision in order to have 3 months to prepare for elections. But the decision was there. We continued as UN to support the idea that elections could take place around the 18th of January because it was important really also to avoid that constitutional issues would emerge if elections would be postponed. And at the same time, we also considered it important not to disturb the decision-making process by saying, and now you have to take a decision, because this is not the way that the world should deal with the new Iraq, if you really want to take it serious, and support it as an advisor and not imposing your views or processes on them. And I think that went actually pretty well. Now we are faced with further complications as the Presidency Council, which consists of President Talabani and vice presidents from both the Sunni and the Shia side, that Vice President Hashemi has now, with a Sunni background, he has now raised objections, particularly in relation to the out-of-country voting, the many Iraqi refugees that are living in other countries, particularly in Jordan and Syria, and he wants to see more representation for them. As we speak, well, probably not now because they all started to sleep, but in the course of this day, there were still hectic negotiations going on to try to see. Hello, Steve. Good to see you. Welcome. Let me welcome you here in your own home.
Say hi to all the people.
Yeah, good. So today there were hectic negotiations going on still to try to resolve the problem, which probably might lead to a further amendment on the election law. And in the optimistic scenario, that could this weekend, Saturday or Sunday, still lead to a vote on the amended law and defining the date of the elections, where we still hope that it could be the 18th of January. But it cannot be excluded that it will take a little bit longer, and then there might be some delay. But my prognosis is that it will not be a delay more than, say, 1 month, which under the circumstances should still be acceptable to all in terms of really appreciating the process that would have led to the adoption of an election law and the further preparations that will be underway to educate voters, to engage voters, to have several hundreds of thousands election monitors going to more than 50,000 voting stations, which all, in historic perspective, is something quite remarkable. And that's what we want to support as UN. Our role is technical support and advice, closely working with the independent High Electoral Commission. But looking over the past few years, as this is the 5th occasion where there is a referendum or an election organized, we have seen a remarkable increase in Iraqi ownership. The Iraqis are in the lead. The role of the UN and of the US, for that matter, has really changed to technical support rather than providing the decisions. And all of those developments point at a direction that would make me cautiously optimistic as to where Iraq is going. Now, obviously, that's not only related to an election law, so let me add a few elements to that and trying to explain why this is probably a realistic perspective. One of the things that we have seen is the remarkable change in the security environment in the past 2 years. I think the great change, the big change took place about 2 years when Prime Minister Maliki confronted the insurgency in the south of the country, really in a way that was at his own personal risk and that of his supporters, but he confronted that violence and started to build a more effective Iraqi security forces trying to face off the insurgents in different parts of the country. In some parts of the country it has been more successful than in other parts of the country, but the overall trend of violence has gone down. It is still substantial. It's quite chilling actually every day to read the number of incidents that are taking place in different parts of the country. But there's no comparison with, say, 2 years ago. And the trend is still downwards, even taking into account the horrific attacks that took place in August and in October, destroying several ministries, many people killed or injured, and particularly attacks that were attacks at the heart of government that also showed the gaps in the security arrangements at the checkpoints that are now almost all of them manned by the Iraqi security forces. So quite a number of issues for the government to confront. But it wouldn't surprise me that also in the elections, when people start to vote and have to think for what reason would we vote for instance, the current Prime Minister, that still the overall feeling of an improved security environment would be a relevant factor for voters to define their preference. I should knock on much wood here, because there is a high alert actually until the elections that still many things could happen, and obviously they could also disturb the total picture, and there are doubtlessly some interests that would like to contribute to that. But it is, in my view, a second factor to be cautiously optimistic about the way that Iraq is heading for at this point in time. A third factor that I'd like to mention is the rapidly increasing interest of investors to invest in Iraq. Certainly not all of them have made that jump already, but there have been important investors' conferences here in DC in October, but also in London and in Berlin. And it all shows that the business world is waking up to the opportunities that Iraq offers, is concerned about the lack of clarity in terms of business legislation. Doing business in Iraq is still a cumbersome thing. Corruption is high. Concerns are all over the place. But the Iraqi government has become increasingly aware that they should do something about it. And it wouldn't surprise me that that will be taken up by a new government quite energetically, especially in the field of oil production. Recently some new important contracts have been signed, and it shows that Iraq is on its way to become a key oil producer again. It's a matter of just a couple of years, I suppose. But at the same time, it is clear that the legal framework for investments and contracts in that oil sector is still shaky, including in the Kurdish region, where a number of contracts have been agreed, but nothing can be implemented as yet because of legal uncertainties. and that also is more and more recognized by leadership both in the Kurdish region and in Baghdad, and in our view will lead to action, and to the extent that it will lead to action will certainly be a very strong signal to investors. What is lacking at this point is a perspective for the people in terms of improvement of the standards of living, the quality of their life, the provision of social services that has certainly been lagging in the past few years, with all the emphasis on security and also the big setback that Iraq experienced with first the sky-high price of oil, and then it went down, and the budget at this moment is not very solid. So immediately the consequences for social service delivery were visible to every Iraqi, and it leaves Iraq with quite a bad infrastructure, with poverty at a level that simply should not exist in a country like Iraq, and lots of problems with effective governance in order to provide the kind of services that people are looking for. And I think it's a safe prediction that apart from the security issues, voting behavior will also be defined by the level of concern or dissatisfaction of people with their daily life. And it's a point that has been particularly stressed by Grand Ayatollah Sistani, who has quite some leverage in shaping public opinion, particularly among Shiites. And he has made consistently a big point of the need that a new government will deliver at the social side. And I think he's right in saying that. And this is certainly also part of the agenda and concerns of the UN to work with the Iraqi government. Now, speaking of our work with the government, I should briefly mention the three most important things on our agenda with the government, obviously led by the government, because our mandate is to act at the request of the government. First of all, in terms of strengthening stability, really investing in the future of the country. It's the Arab Kurds agenda. The UN has published extensive reports on the disputed internal boundaries, as it is called, between the Arab and the Kurds. And on the basis of those reports, we have started a process to try to bring together both sides, addressing key issues for the future of the country, for the future of the federal state, and also demarcating the opportunities, but also the limits to the autonomy of the Kurdish region. A high-level task force meets regularly under our chairmanship, bringing together key advisors of Prime Minister Maliki and President Barzani, and speaking about rather specific issues such as property rights, detainees and missing persons, language rights in the disputed areas, and trying to come up with practical solutions that would lead to improvements on the ground, so that people would start to see that there's something in these political processes for them. One example is the school buildings in particularly Kirkuk and some other places that at this moment are occupied by organizations or by families living there. As a consequence, there's a big shortage of school buildings, which depresses really the quality of education. And we try now with both the Kurdish government and the Iraqi government to turn that around in a very practical way. This is important to pursue, and so we will. But at the same time, it will be necessary also to find ways to address the core political issues, the status of Kirkuk, that is claimed by the Kurdish region, but where many Arabs and Turkomen are living, and that certainly is not accepted at the Arab sides, that it would be part of the Kurdish region. And I think all observers agree that that is probably the most sticking issue for the future of Iraq. But it's not only Kirkuk, also in the provinces of Nineveh and Diyala, there are issues, territorial issues also, and issues of which administration is competent to deliver. There are Kurdish groups living there that have to deal with Arab majorities that feel that they are under pressure, that want to join actually the Kurdish region. But obviously that is not a very easy thing to achieve. And all of those issues have been put in the inventory of the reports that we have published, and they should somehow become part of a negotiation between the two sides. And right now we are trying to think how a process could start, how a process could be facilitated by the UN after the elections to address those key issues for the future. A second big point on our agenda is the relations between Iraq and Kuwait. They are still not normalized, one could say, after the first Gulf War, 1990-1991. It is connected with Iraq still being under Chapter 7 sanctions of the UN Charter, as it has not yet complied with all the provisions of many resolutions that have been adopted on the situation in Iraq in the past 20 years. Understandably, Iraq wants that those provisions will be lifted, as they claim with a lot of justification that all those sanctions were put on the regime of Saddam Hussein, and that those that are in power now, suffered as much from Saddam Hussein as the Kuwaitis or others for that matter. But yet there is the concern at the Kuwaiti sides that there is not yet an unambiguous reaffirmation of the borders between the two countries. And this is something that is then also on the plate of the UN. The Security Council is basically responsible for managing this issue, and we have been asked to try to bring parties together in order to find a solution. And solving it will again be a contribution to stability in Iraq, to the credibility of the government and its future policies, and basically the normalization of Iraq as a partner of the world community. And it's therefore very important to pursue that cause. And the third point that I should mention is the agenda for the next few years, the economic strategy, and particularly also the budget management. I refer to the oil price that is very much predominantly managing Iraq's budget. When the price is high, lots of money gets in and it's spent immediately. And when it is low, immediate budget cuts are following. This is simply not a way to run an economy or a state. And what we see also is that the budget is hardly connected with the priorities of the line ministries and vice versa. And trying to support the institution building at the side of government, and the strengthening also planning processes and responsibilities within the government, with a stronger role of the Ministry of Finance, is actually a key thing, also to make sure that Iraq, in interaction with the World Bank and the IMF, can really put its economic development on the basis of a longer term planning, which has not been the case in previous years. understandably probably in the situation in which Iraq found itself after 2003, but now we're 6 years later, and basically the new elections are the start of the first period of the new Iraq really being on its own in terms of responsibility and management of the state and the economy. And that is quite a defining moment for the Iraqi leadership. And I believe that many leaders of the different political groups have a sense of responsibility to assume that responsibility at this particular moment, and that's how we want to support them, where certainly the US will remain a very important partner on the basis of the bilateral cooperation framework that was concluded recently. But at the same time, the drawdown of the forces will be a very important moment, but of course also a test case whether security will hold. And there are basically two scenarios. Either the Iraqis have managed to gradually build their own security forces to a level that will provide the minimum necessary security at the time that the drawdown effects of the US forces will become more tangible and visible, or insurgents are laying low and really waiting for their opportunity, and will no doubt also test the strength of the Iraqi security forces in that same period of time. And that obviously will then also define to which extent Iraq is attractive as a country to invest. Iraq will be able to deliver the services to its people, to create a climate for private initiative and business in its own country. There are lots of opportunities. I don't think anybody can have doubts on that. There are far less certainties. But there is something going on in the country that, makes me, in response to your introductory question, cautiously optimistic as to where it has arrived at this point in time and where it might be heading for in the foreseeable future. So thank you very much for sharing that, being able to share that with you.
Thank you. And we're going to switch now. Steve's going to pick it up.
Great.
But thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks so much, Patrick. Ad, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Good to see everyone. I just flew in from Rome, where we were discussing this, in fact, over there. I was going to say, because I didn't hear what Patrick said, that you sound cautiously optimistic. So glad we got that carried away. But let me probe a little bit in terms of this cautious optimism that you have. You know, one of the parts, the building blocks in Iraq that some were worried about before the surge were the al-Sadr brigades and others that were essentially also worried about the Iraqis that had left and come back, and to what degree simmering tensions, particularly Sunni Shia tensions, may come back into the picture. Do you have any sense whether the people themselves sense any, are they breathing a sigh of relief? Are they beginning to go back to old communities? Are they beginning to mix again? Or has the ethnic sort of reorganization and segregation that we saw going on largely held?
You know, I'm still not sure, actually, in that sense, about the real Iraq. And I think many of us have still difficulties to understand what's going on, because many people that I speak with are all the time underscoring the point: Iraqis have a long tradition of living together, being from different sects or ethnic backgrounds. And in many ways that is still continuing, except at those places where really they were ousted. And of course there are many displaced, and some displaced will not be able to go back where they came from. But that's not necessarily the picture for the country as a whole. And much will depend now on how political leaders will define their position. And here it looks like the current Prime Minister Maliki is trying genuinely to reach out to other groups, so he has brought on board some of the Sunni leadership, and also some other leaders that are claiming an important position, like Alawi, are trying to reach out to different groups in the spectrum. And we see a competition, a political competition within the Shia side between the Islamic group, so to speak, and Maliki, which all will have consequences for the way that people will interact with each other. But the sense is that Iraq has stepped a bit away from the strictly sectarian kind of politics that one saw some time ago. But it's certainly too early to make a call as to how that will work out over the coming years.
Thank you. Well, let me open the floor and others. Patrick.
I think you started to get to my question there with the statement that Maliki is really stepping up and starting to really be use his good offices to mediate. And that gets to my question. It seems like the United States has had a series of proconsuls resident in Baghdad, from Bremer to Zal-Khalilzad. Now we've got Chris Hill. What you described was a much more process-oriented mediation role of the United Nations. There's a lot more talks. It seems to be a very constitutional process. How would you describe the role of the United States now in Iraq under Chris Hill and the relationship of the UN, given that it had been so dominated by the United States? And to what extent have politics been captured by the constitutional process in Iraq?
Well, it's for a UN civil servant always a tricky issue to discuss about individual member states. But you know, the US, it's no problem to discuss about the US. No, I mean, I can just testify in the interaction with the US, as I have experienced it myself in the past few months, that I think the US is understanding pretty well that the roles have changed or are changing. It's of course always a process, and in the way that the US also really assisted in a constructive way the election law discussion and process, it was quite clear that there could be no repetition. It would also not have been accepted by the Iraqi side that things could be prescribed. But it was really also assisting parties in looking at the longer term agenda, advising, and in the end just sitting and waiting until the vote started. And neither the UN nor the US knew exactly what was going to be the end result. Let me give you a second example of something that defines in a quite remarkable way the role of the US at this point. That is in bringing closer together the Iraqi army and the Peshmerga, so the military force of the Kurdish region, in joint security arrangements in the disputed areas, joint checkpoints, joint patrols, joint coordination. It's not yet been ratified by Prime Minister Maliki, but everyone is optimistic that this will fly, and General Odierno and his team have played a very constructive role, as far as I could tell, in bringing the different parties together. And from the UN perspective, I consider that as something very important, because if one tries to think, when one tries to think about the, say, political rapprochement and trying to find common ground between the Kurds and the Arabs in the future, one would like to see some security arrangements underpinning that. And with the US drawdown, it will be difficult to foresee a direct US role for that. So maybe the international community should step up the plate. But the more a pattern of cooperation and coordination is established there, the easier it will be for us to work with that in the future. And I think those are two good examples of the kind of role that the U.S. is playing right now.
During the election law discussion at the beginning, I had received reports from a senior White House person that Joe Biden played a very key role with at least Chris Hill and Odierno. It was reported to me that he was also dealing with the UN, and I hadn't realized that probably meant you. I don't know the protocol, but did Biden play a constructive role from your perspective, and were you involved in some of these discussions that he was having long distance with his team?
Yeah, no, he is truly involved. I mean, it's not just to make the statement that he is following. He's truly involved, also personally engaged, and as you know very well, he builds, of course, on much experience with Iraq as a senator and true engagement. He is actually on standby to make calls when it's necessary to whomever is necessary to call at that level. And that is, and we are closely in the loop, and also there's a direct interaction as necessary, and we find it very encouraging.
Alan Platt, and we'll go back over here.
I'd like to ask you about oil development, which is obviously so important to Iraq's future. You briefly mentioned a couple of contracts that have been signed recently. You also talked about Chapter 7 and continuing corruption, and that you hope that there'd be an energetic, or you anticipated an energetic effort after the new elections. What is your perspective on the continuation of the Development Fund for Iraq and the UN Claims Commission effort, and how is that going in terms of negotiating down the claims of the Kuwaitis?
Well, I think most of the claims of the Kuwaitis have now been dealt with, although there are still quite some payments that needs to be ensured. So I think we're now approaching the end of that road. As always is the case with these kind of mechanisms, it's legally quite protracted. It's sometimes easier to establish them than to unwind them. But normalization of that part of how Iraq is dealing with the world, basically, is on the agenda and should be pursued. We cannot foresee a situation where, say, all the political obstacles are out of the way, and then these mechanisms still suggest that Iraq is in a kind of special position. But it will take some time, of course.
This gentleman.
Thanks. I'm glad you mentioned schools, and I'm wondering what the international community's responsibility is as far as some of the quality of life issues you mentioned, and is there some strategic thought given to this? Because obviously the good education produces leadership and all this kind of thing, and whether it's the UN or the various countries want to fund, NGOs or whatever, how much thought is being given to this, and how much interest, frankly, do you see from Iraq in, civil society and that sort of thing?
Well, I think it's not in the first place a matter of funding, because basically the Iraqis should be able to fund themselves. But say the kind of technical advice, helping them also to organize government, not only in Baghdad, but also at the level of governorates. And many governors are very interested in having a stronger UN role, or to work with bilateral partners in, for instance, education or health service delivery. There are lots of opportunities there. The Iraqis do recognize it. They have just finished a first stage of what they call their National Development Plan, which is, I think, the first effort more strategically to look at the different roles and responsibilities of the government, including in the areas that you mention. Still remains to be seen how that will be translated in the budget. That's why I refer to this disconnect between budget and priorities, and to which extent the new government will really take that up. But this is actually a kind of crucial role for us and the World Bank and for bilateral partners, including also the US. One example, with UK assistance, there is now a project going on with the Office of the Prime Minister to prepare the transition from this government to the next government, which I think is extremely important in terms of institution building, adhering to the continuity of processes. What we try to add to that is a recognition of the key priorities in a more substantive sense, and that's where we can play a useful role.
And Maliki's been cooperative with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
This gentleman. And then, is that Mark Goldberg? Then Mark Goldberg. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for your comments. 2 questions. What are the UN mission's overall key priorities for human rights in Iraq? And then secondly, more specifically, how soon will we see a Human Rights Commission in place?
Let me start with the second question. We were relatively hopeful when the Iraqi parliament at last agreed to set up that commission, that it could still start before the end of the term of this parliament. By now it has run into some problems in finding and selecting the members of the commission, and basically we have advised against too much hurry at the point that it looked like it was going to be hijacked for certain political interests. So we have said, well, take it easy. This must be really a process based on the quality of the selection of people, because otherwise the credibility of the Commission will be at stake. So my expectation is that this is something that will only happen at the start of the new Parliament, but we continue to assist that process. In terms of the priorities on human rights, well, there are many. I should say that the formal recognition of its responsibility by the Iraqi government has been quite positive. At the same time, we know that there are many issues in the country. Let me mention 2 that I find of particular concern. One is the relentless attacks on by insurgents. So one could say, well, it's not a state, so it's maybe a different way of looking at human rights. But looking at police officers and other people that are serving the state, public servants, they are under relentless attack, and I think their position should be more protected. And the second is the position of women. I think in many parts of the country one sees very appalling practices and many suicides of women that probably are the tip of the iceberg as to what cultural traditions brings with them. And I think that it's a role of the UN to try to address that and to try to raise awareness. There are other areas like the position of detainees and the situation in prisons that have our attention, and then due process and building, say, the judiciary, supporting the judiciary in really providing the opportunities for Iraqis to claim their rights, and that is probably one of the key tasks in supporting their capacity building at government side, in order to see a positive effect on human rights in the longer run.
Before I go to Mark, can I just build on this question that I don't want to mention who, a senior State Department official talking about detentions in Afghanistan made the point that the Afghanistan prison system and detention system was a breeding ground for the Taliban and fundamentalists, because you essentially are jailing all of these people for sort of low-level, low-octane crimes, setting them away they can't get out. But any kingpins, powerful sort of criminal agents, or those that are engaged in truly nefarious organizational activity can get out in a nanosecond out of the Afghan prisons. To what degree, that used to be the case in Iraq. I don't know what the case is today. To what degree is there still a residue of that sort of problem in the Iraqi prison and judicial system?
Well, I I couldn't be too specific because then I should really look at also the trends and the data. But I think it's probably fair to say that we're not yet there. That there are still many issues with the prison system. And frankly, I consider it also sometimes a dilemma, because we see it as an important part of our human rights work. We write about it in our human rights reports. At the same time, you don't want to send a signal to the Iraqi people that what you care about most is the rights of prisoners, because there's always a kind of balance that you need to look for in the country, given the circumstances and the dire situation in which many people live.
Mark Olberg.
I have sort of a two-part question about the refugee situation. Is the international community doing enough to support the governments of Jordan and Syria in their efforts to take care of Iraqi refugees? And secondly, have Western governments processed sufficiently claims of asylum? Are there enough opportunities for Iraqis who can't return to Iraq to come to Western countries?
Well, I mean, on the second question, I know that quite a few governments, in particular European governments, are wrestling with the question whether they could send back Iraqis that claimed asylum in an earlier stage. Yes, it can be risky to send back people, maybe in some instances or some places, but I would find it a bit difficult to reconcile that view with what one sees developing in Iraq, with a government in charge, a government that adheres to certain principles of human rights, and admittedly, in practice, it's sometimes still quite difficult to implement that. But you're not talking about the former Iraq anymore, so that's increasingly going to be a difficult issue to address in terms of the claims of individuals that they would fear persecution in their own country. And on the refugees, well, I think there's quite some support for refugees, actually. The fundraising for that is the easiest part of any fundraising for Iraq still today. The problem with the refugees is that it's far from clear how many refugees really would like to return to Iraq. And that's why it is a bit difficult to address that also in terms of our own political work. And UNHCR and others are very much involved with that. We help refugees to come back. But the number of refugees going back is probably lower than one could expect just on the basis of the situation in the country. That's why also in the interaction with the administration here, we've made a point that probably is wise, first of all, to give priority to help internally displaced. Some can return to where they lived. For others, it will be quite difficult. But then it is important to provide them with a basis to find employment, housing, and all these things. So it's a mixed picture, basically.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I have also two questions following the trend. My first one is regarding the Constitution. For some time, we've been hearing about amending the Constitution ever since it was actually passed. What's your concern regarding the status of the Constitution and that there's still huge amendments waiting? My second question is regarding the Iraq Compact with the UN. Where is that process going? Are you expecting to have another international conference for the Iraq Compact? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, on Constitution, it's true that there are a number of amendments that have been agreed by the Council of Representatives already, and that should be put up for a referendum in order to be included in the Constitution. As far as we can tell now, it is not very likely that that referendum will be introduced together with the parliamentary elections. So it means that it will still be on hold. It may be combined at a later stage with other amendments on the Constitution that may be desired. Probably one could argue that some amendments to the Constitution would even be necessary as part of a deal between Arabs and Kurds, particularly when you look at issues of revenue sharing and oil management. But it may also complicate matters. So whether you want to go there, it's unclear. So it's pending. That's a short answer, actually, to the question. On the compact with Iraq, which was 3 years ago, the effort by the then administration, together with the Iraqi government, to organize a kind of partnership between neighboring countries and European countries and the US and Iraq. We have recently had a meeting on that to take stock, and basically the conclusion in the meeting was we have reached the end of that compact in that form, on that basis. The Iraqis are very much of the opinion, Prime Minister Maliki was quite many times on record on that they want to take the lead, and they consider the compact more a kind of, how to say it, a bit of a paternalistic way of looking at Iraq, so that they had to meet the benchmarks, and that every year partners came together in order to see whether they had succeeded in making all those benchmarks. They want to decide themselves, they want to be in the lead. The National Development Plan they see very much as their platform for the future. And we have actually agreed that we will now change also the role of the UN, which was the co-chair of that compact, to more a secretariat and liaison function, supporting Iraq, bringing also partners together, because that's still important. And basically a new mechanism will be elaborated in the near future, but that's probably going to be the responsibility of the new government to do so.
Let's go to this gentleman here. There's 1, 2, and 3. I think we'll cut it off there. Yes.
I'd like to ask about the military situation. I remember a few years ago when we began to see increasing success, a lot was mentioned about the role of the awakening and the role of the U.S. military, particularly in infusing them with a lot of money to help with dealing with al-Qaeda in Iraq. I'm wondering now, with the role of the U.S. going down, and presumably those payments either greatly decreasing or no longer being available, do we still have that kind of solid support, or is that going to be a problem again?
So what happens when Iraq's stimulus package runs out, right?
Well, maybe there could be a new stimulus package. It's a very good question. And I think much will depend on the recognition also by the new government that they will have to think through and probably take also more seriously the integration of particularly Sunnis in running the state and running the security apparatus. Because you're right that because of that construction and that money available, it was possible actually to undo some of the probably big mistakes that have been made in the very beginning. But it's not yet structurally founded, so something should be done about that, which should be primarily the responsibility of the Iraqi government. But clearly the international community should stand by, because otherwise you would run a big risk of disintegration and going back to where you don't want to return.
Yes, ma'am.
I was in Iraq in 2004 and 2005 as member of the Dutch embassy.
Welcome.
When I was there, so I've seen the UN coming back, which I think was a very good and very brave thing to do. However, in those days it was very, very difficult to do your job because of the security situation. All of us were more or less locked up in the Fortress Green Zone. From what you told me and what I read, it's much better now. But can you please elaborate a little bit how well UN can do their work, by which I mean traveling in the country, talking with local authorities, visiting projects? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. It is still quite a challenge, I must say. I mean, with my political background, the normal thing to do is really you go to everyone, you go everywhere, you want to see with your own eyes and sense and smell what's going on. And that is in many ways still not possible. Or you arrive, with due respect, but in big panzered armored cars of the US Army. And frankly, after skipping military service in my own country, I would not have expected to be in that position ever in my life. So it's something that we hope will change. We have found a way to be certainly much more in direct contact with the population than before, because we and also many agencies, funds and programs of the UN are working through many Iraqis. And we do that not only from Baghdad, but also in Mosul and in Basra and in Kirkuk and in Erbil. Certainly we have a big office in Erbil, and the situation in the Kurdish region is a lot more stable and easier to work with. So many more things are happening than in the period that you refer to. But still, quite a few people of the UN are working from Amman or Kuwait, simply because we have a ceiling of people that we can have because of the security arrangements. The expectations are that the UN could be more present in the country. That's also what the Iraqis ask us all the time. And we hope that after the elections, our assessment of the situation could be more positive. However, I should add that just a study of the websites of different insurgent groups and terrorists shows that the UN is still considered a primary target. And it means we cannot underestimate anything, and you've seen also the horror in Afghanistan recently, and we have to take that into account, unfortunately.
Do most of the Iraqis still see you as a proxy for the United States, or are you beginning to get an independent identity again?
I think it's fair to say that at the level of our direct partners in government and parliament, and also leaders of civil society groups, that they see very well and recognize, say, the impartiality and the neutrality of the role that we play. But I'm pretty convinced that, say, with ordinary citizens, the prevailing idea is still what you say, and it will take a long time to change that. Yeah.
Interesting. Yes, sir. Right here.
So, excuse me. You talked at great length about Iraq's sort of internal political development, but I was hoping if you could comment briefly on their evolving regional status and their relationship with Iran, Turkey, Syria, Jordan, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, I had, of course, hoped that I could confine myself to the internal situation. But I mean, it's a very important question, because what one sees in Iraq is an enormous interest of the region in its future, and unfortunately not always in a positive sense. And the future of Iraq, to quite an extent, will be defined by the seriousness of its neighbors to be a constructive partner instead of something different. A good example of that constructive partnership, in my view, is these days displayed by Turkey. Turkey is extraordinarily active, not only in Iraq, but in the region more generally. They don't hide that, of course, they have a stake also in the future of the Kurdish region and the way that that will be organized politically and administratively. But they also see Iraq as a true economic partner, a corridor, and really also, say, an extension of a regional cooperation that they are quite proactively developing right now, and which for my fellow Europeans should be a strong signal to take the membership bid of Turkey for the European Union more seriously than many people do. Sorry for making this statement.
Not at all.
I have to every now and then.
That's great. I don't know if David Smith was introduced earlier in this, but I do want to thank David so much for bringing this here. Now I'm going to ask David's indulgence, probably frustrate him for a moment, because I'm going to ask you not to be Mr. International Civil Servant, which we're so proud of what you're doing both at the bank and UN, but remember your deep roots as a European politician. And we now have today the news. I just got off the plane and saw the news that the former Belgian Prime Minister is about to become the new President of Europe. And let me frame it this way.
Could I say to you, Steve,
yeah.
that I think Melchior is probably one of the few people in this town who will be able to pronounce the man's name.
Yes, I was going to say, can you tell me how to say his name? That's number one. Number two, the other interesting bit here, for there's some journalists in the room, Mark Goldberg can do this. You know, Barack Obama, when he was candidate Obama, and Chuck Hagel was on that trip, I tried really hard to get him to go spend 15 minutes in Brussels. And I said, you may go to all these power centers, but to miss the heart of Europe as it sees itself may be a mistake. And he didn't go. And he didn't go again when he was, you know, fully loaded president. So there is an interesting thing here. But how does these new shifts in leadership in Europe as a whole, both in foreign policy and in the presidency, how do you think they're going to affect out-of-area commitments by Europe in places like Iraq and Afghanistan? Are you worried about that? Does it become an inhibitor, or does it become something that it empowers greater action? I can construct an easy argument arguing, you know, many Americans think this will make a more bold and robust Europe. But when I look at sort of the deal-making that went on with this leadership, you can make exactly the opposite case. And so I'm interested in how we'll turn off the UN hat here for a moment. So,
I don't know what the Secretary General will think of that, but let's see. First of all, the pronunciation of the new President of the Council, that is Herman van Rompuy.
We'll have this on YouTube and run it over and over and over again.
And I can only say this because this is due to the Dutch colonial relationship with Belgium, of course. Well, you know, Steve, I mean, and this is not wanting to be diplomatic, because frankly, I could have imagined other outcomes of this process. And maybe, and my view was, I mean, there were two views basically on, say, not the personality, but the type of profile that should best represent the newly created position of President of the European Council. Some argued that it is essential that the new person can bring the internal process together, make it more coherent, and in making it more coherent, also more effective, including its impact externally. And others said, no, you need a profile of a person, and of course Blair was very much in the picture for that, who is already established at in the world theater, and who can really make an impact there. Now, one should understand where Europe is coming from. Everybody has followed how difficult it was to get to the agreement. It took 8 years to agree on the Lisbon Treaty. And yet it continues to be what I consider, from my generation, a success story of building international cooperation and cohesion in an unprecedented way with new institutions and institutional arrangements. Given the protracted process of getting here, it is inevitable that it still needs some years to, so to speak, to heal the wounds, or to find new momentum and sense of purpose. And in that sense, the choice for a person like Mr. Van Rompuy, who has the credibility to bring actors together, could help to strengthen actually this new mechanism, because I'm convinced that this new mechanism will at some point show the dynamics that always has underpinned the new structures in the European Union. It creates something new also in the world context. The same goes for the High Representative on foreign affairs, and actually there I predict that the momentum will be more forceful, and you will notice more of that also in DC, because it's not only the High Representative, but it's also the European Diplomatic Service that is now established. So you will see in the coming years 2,000 to 3,000 people, and I hope and I expect the best and brightest from the capitals, that will start to build a mechanism in Brussels that will advise the High Representative, the Commission, and to an extent also the Council, and that will make Europe more a player than they are now. Nevertheless, I intend to see the new High Representative as soon as possible and to tell her that what I find lacking in Baghdad, certainly also with the perspective of the American drawdown, is a clear European policy. And could you please start to create one?
Can you all sort of sense the passion and deep understanding of these questions from Ad Melkert on this issue? One wonders whether you have interest in this position now down the road at some point.
Well,
I won't let you answer that. That really would get you in trouble.
It's 5 years ahead, you know.
Yeah.
You never know.
As I said, everyone, I really want to thank Ad. I did fly in from Rome. I was at an international conference yesterday. I mentioned, in fact, that I was going to be seeing you and hosting here and rushing back, and there are so many people there. I was impressed to see the number of Europeans who knew you, who knew of what you were doing in Iraq, and were very positive about that. Ad, of course, was here in Washington and was here in this, not in this room, but at the New America Foundation, right when we were a pipsqueak organization with about 6 staff. So it's wonderful to see you again. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you. Thanks to David.
Thank you. Great to see you.